to thank I also want to thank all of our presenters who are joined us here today. I hope you have had a chance to look at the presentations and the schedules, or even looked up some of our awesome presenters and their websites. I do want to note and thank our presenters that this is purely a volunteer symposium. And so we wanted to make this free for all of our attendees. All of the presenters have volunteered their time, their knowledge and wisdom, and their emotions to be with us here today. So I know that we're all very grateful to be in this space together. This is a free conference and no one is profiting from this. And so I wanted to thank all of them with that as well. I also want to acknowledge there are some super awesome folks who are presenting today. Definitely consider using them as speakers and consultants for your campuses and organizations. I know that they will do wonderful work for you, and I hope you get to have a little preview of all of their knowledge today. As far as the flow for today, we're in general session right now in a webinar today, right now at the beginning, and then at the end again with Gabe Javier, who will be our closing speaker. In the middle of the day, we have multiple options for folks. Each of the sessions will have 3 different speakers for you to choose from. I know that you probably want to join all of them. Feel free to bounce around if you need to a little bit, but also they will be recorded. And if you registered for this event, we will be emailing out all of the links so you can watch these presentations afterward as well. At the end of the day, we know that it is very difficult to often be in BIQTPOC spaces that are centering racial identity, gender identity, and sexual identity. So we do have an optional social for anyone who wants to join us. We would love to be in community and to have an informal hangout. And Mario Rodriguez will be hosting that space. The link is in the schedule that was sent out to you as well. So I have the extreme pleasure to be with all of you today and to tell you a little bit about how we got to this point and how this book and how this symposium evolved. And so if you are just joining us, I am Dr. Joshua Moon Johnson. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I was one of the co-editors of this book along with Gabe Javier. My normal job is I'm a Dean of Student Services at American River College in Sacramento, California. And also I do consulting and speaking with PMJ Consulting with my colleague, Dr. Emily Prieto-Saragunis. This symposium really started as my journey as a researcher, a writer, a social justice advocate, a student affairs professional. So to tell you a little bit more about that experience, I began researching religion and sexuality, and this was directly related to my experience and background, but not something I intentionally chose. When I started my doctoral program in higher education at Northern Illinois University, my advisor at the time and now my mentor and friend, Dr. Lemuel Watson, I walked into his office and I said, do you need help with any research projects? And he said, yeah, I wanted to do some research around like gay Christian students. And at that moment, like I panicked. At the point in my life, this was something that was very real to me. And I have no idea how Lemuel knew this or didn't know this, but I wanted to start researching and I wanted to engage with this person who was the dean of my college of education, but it terrified me. And largely because this was something I was trying to work out for myself. And so I was this 25-year-old doctoral student who was trying to figure out my own identities around religious identity, spiritual identity, and sexual identity. That topic ended up becoming my dissertation topic and my first book. And this is a topic I still research and speak on for 15 years now almost. And this is something that is so core to me as well around my identity and my purpose that I feel like as an educator and an advocate and just a human in this world as well. So as I started this research, it was really around religion, and religion is directly tied to spirituality, which is different if you wanted to we could get into it. And that's directly connected to purpose, especially as we're talking about college students. Purpose, religion, spirituality have direct links of what they're doing with their life. And so as I started to do this qualitative study to get these understandings of what do Christian students who are in same-sex relationships experience and how do they navigate this conflict? And so as I was writing a dissertation, I was advised to be very specific with it. However, race and ethnicity kept coming up in these narratives and these stories that I was engaging with students with that as well. And so I ended up approaching this work with an intersectional approach to looking at sexual identity development, faith identity development, and then later on ethnic and racial identity development. And it got very messy. And so these theoretical models or identity development models didn't always make sense. And that's really what I was trying to pick apart and understand with that as well. And realistically, this was something that was super beneficial to me. And as hard as it was for me to get into this because it was so raw and traumatic for me personally, it also helped me to process as an individual. I remember interviewing students and then going home and transcribing the interviews, just sitting at my kitchen table, crying as I listened to these heartbreaking narratives. And I think that there were so many stories that were directly relevant to my life. However, there were so many stories that were very different than what I experienced with that as too. And so, as I tried to make sense of religious identity and sexual identity, there was no exact way to pull out racial and ethnic identity for many of the participants, where 50% of my participants I've identified as by QTPOC. And so with that, when we were saying like, okay, we're talking about your Christian identity, many of our folks, there was no real separation when it came to community. So I was interviewing Black students who talked about they attended a Black church and a Black community. And so that was directly connected to it. Similarly, there were folks who identified as Mexican Catholic, Vietnamese Catholic, Korean Protestant, and those cultural ties with those religious community ties were not easily able to separate. And I think about my mother who immigrated from Korea in the 1970s to Mississippi. There were very few Korean folks there. And if you were a Korean person in the Mississippi coast at that time, you went to the Korean church. We're kind of regardless of religious identity, but because that was the Korean community center in many ways for that as well. So now I'll jump into tell you a little bit of a highlight around how these challenges showed up for folks as they were trying to navigate many of these different pieces. And so the first thing is like external types of issues. So BIQTPOC people deal with racism, homophobia, transphobia, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, all at the same time. And these can also often take place in the form of violence, rejection, emotional abuse, discrimination, microaggressions. And so we know that's true of the students that we're working with. We know that's true of our own individual lives as well. And with that, beyond dealing with all of those things, folks who are part of these Christian religious communities, when they lost community, this was a huge challenge for many folks as well. So not only are you dealing with those things, but when you lose a community, and that loss of community could be your church community, your family community, and you have no place to get support and to process for these as well. And so people are often forced to choose how to show up in which spaces for different identities. Even within when many of the participants and myself included, when we enter these queer spaces, they're often very white dominant. And so even though you're in an affirming space of your queerness or your transness, it can often be very white dominant, operate out of white supremacist ideas, and often can be very anti-religious and anti-spiritual in many spaces too. And not to blame folks, because specifically talking about the Christian faith and Christian organization, there has been lots of trauma that folks have been forced to as well. Even as participants chose to try to find open and affirming churches, those open and affirming churches often were very white dominant as well. And then oftentimes people just made a statement and they threw up a rainbow flag and they thought that that meant that they were actually being inclusive and supportive. However, they still operate out of heteronormative and cisnormative spaces as well, without doing anything besides saying all means all, which is a great starting point, but we need to do better than that. Some of the internal issues that folks had to deal with. One is, as I was talking about, this lack of community or this loss of community around your racial and cultural communities, your religious community, or even times your queer and trans community. People felt like they had isolation. There was no space for them to fully connect with others. And oftentimes folks were dealing with things like self-harm and self-hatred and shame. And many times fighting outside and external organizations is easier than having to fight those internal battles and that constant socialization that we have learned our entire lives. So that idea of self-hatred and shame was an ongoing lifelong journey. And so I know that that probably resonates with many of us here in this space today too. So as people try to figure out this isolation, it was this lack of community and loss of space. And this was something for me that I dealt with and continue to deal with. And I think it's been definitely, I think, easier for me to understand and navigate as an individual. I am multiracial, and so growing up in Southern Mississippi as a mixed race Asian American, white American person, I got very used to not having a community or fitting in. And I know that definitely with my proximity to whiteness, my dad is white, I pass as white in some spaces too. And so I can be a part of many spaces, but never really a part of any space with that as well. And that's something that I kind of had to get used to as an adult. With that as well, my gender expression never really fit. I identify as a femqueer man, and I've always kind of blurred with masculinity and femininity. And so when I've lost spaces like my church space or church community, racial and religious communities, it was something that I had to teach myself how to be very independent, and in many ways, how to just not rely on others as well. With my own community and background as well, as I said, grew up in a mixed race interracial family, as well as my parents are Pentecostal ministers. Hallelujah. So that was the environment that I grew up in. And I had to figure out how to navigate all those spaces too. And that was definitely a challenge with that. Connected to our college students, and we think about when you lose a religious or spiritual community, because many folks who identify as Christian, who are navigating their religious and racial communities, ended up choosing to part ways with religious identity and organizations, which was directly connected to a loss of purpose. And so when people have centered their purpose on spiritual identity or spiritual relationships, and they've lost that, they've lost a segment of their purpose. And that's really challenging for folks to have to navigate. So that was something that many of our participants talked about. How do they find that as well? This is just a brief summary of some of the challenges that is overviewed through my research in my first book. And I don't want to leave it at a point of just challenges. I want us to think about, for us as individuals, what can we do to make ourselves and our organizations able to support folks who are navigating conflicts with religious and spiritual identity, their racial and ethnic communities, and their gender and sexual identities. One, I encourage you to lead and encourage intersectional programs and support spaces. I know many of you here on this call today lead programs, support services, or direct work with students, trying to do that in complicating narratives around identity and bringing a true intersectional approach to that as well. Offer counter narratives. Myself included, and many of these participants have never even known that was a consideration to be queer, trans identified, and religious and spiritual. And so I challenge you to create opportunities for people to see visible role models, expose them to media, and allow them to know that this is a narrative. Normalize conversations around religion and spirituality, especially those folks who are in public higher education. Most institutions that are public shy away from having any conversations around religion and spirituality. I guarantee you that many of your students, this is core to their identity. This is core to how they process their worldview, as well as they process their purpose. So I challenge you to build up the capacity to understand and be able to talk about faith, religion, and spirituality on your campuses. Please make sure your mental health professionals are aware and able to help students navigate these intersectional identities, as well as the conflicts that go along with them. I also ask that you partner with local religious organizations, spiritual organizations, as well as student ministries if you have them on your campus. If you are a part of an open and affirming church, please do better than just putting up a rainbow flag. This is my challenge to you right now, to do a full examination of culture, rituals, policies, and protocols, and examine them from a cis-normative, heteronormative lens to challenge that organization to do more than put up a flag. And also within those spaces too, challenging ideas of white supremacy and patriarchy, knowing that many of our specifically Christian religious organizations were founded and operate in many of those spaces too. The conversations and the research that I have done have been centered around Christianity. I am Christian, and that is a huge part of my identity and my faith background. And I encourage you to expand this conversation beyond Christianity. I'm happy to have conversations and to partner with folks who have ideas of how to do that, and to be an accomplice and a support for those conversations as well. So I just wanted to start out that conversation and to talk about many of these intersections with that. And throughout today, you will be able to join with participants who are in the conversations for our breakouts that will go deeper into these things. So wanted to highlight a few of those. And so Vivi Wynn's conversation around rural spaces, a lot of my research directly tied to how people in rural spaces navigate this. Dr. Ashley Smith-Providence will be talking about hate and bias incidents for QTPOC folks as well, which is definitely true and real to how people navigate this life and experience that too. And so those are two that I think that this research that I started expands into. So as we move into wrapping up our opening session, thinking about why did we write this Queer People of Color in Higher Education book? As I kind of shared, a lot of my original research evolved into me becoming a director of the LGBT Center at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I grew a lot as a person and a professional, and I moved from being a director of an LGBT center to being a director and assistant dean of a multicultural center at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I got to meet and collaborate directly with Gabe Javier. And at that time, Gabe was the director of the LGBT Center and assistant dean there too. And we had many conversations around these spaces exist in different places. And with that as well, we wanted to talk about how do we actively collaborate and bring in an intersectional approach to this. University of Wisconsin-Madison also had a program called Crossroads, where we had a full-time professional dedicated to serving BIQTPOC people. So with those, we were able to put some of these ideas into practice, and Gabe and I were like, this needs to be produced, this needs to be published, with this knowledge needs to be shared with folks too. With that, we assembled this dynamic team of writers, researchers, and activists to create this book that we're going to hear a little bit more about today. And so with that, we created this book, and it has been very well received, and we are super excited with that too. Even today, when we talked about doing this virtual symposium, I thought 30 people would maybe join us on a Zoom hangout and we would talk about our research, and we were overwhelmed with the response. So thank you all for joining us today. We've had over 900 people register to be a part of this symposium throughout the day. And I am just moved and overwhelmed that this research matters, this conversation matters for all of you who are here today with us today. So whether you are a part of the BIQTPOC family and want to just be in community, or if you are folks who are being able to serve students, we appreciate you and thank you for joining us and making this, this knowledge and this work important as we move forward with that as well. With that, I am going to formally conclude our time